UFOs, monsters, mysteries. You're listening to Talking Weird. And now, from a cabin deep in the Northwoods, your hosts, Dr. Dean Bertram and Jen Durrell.
Welcome to Talking Weird. I'm flying solo this week. Jen unfortunately is sick, but she'll be back for the next episode. Our guest this week is probably one of the most savvy thinkers on all things weird and paranormal, from my old stomping ground of Sydney, Australia. He appears as one of the main experts in Don Mears' recent addition to his Australian Skies series, Australian Skies 3, Search for the Min Min. Our guest this week also produced his own audio documentary on Australian UFO encounters for a major broadcaster in that country. That documentary is called To Catch a Flying Star. He's also the Vice President of Australia's UFO Research New South Wales, a well-known DJ, performance artist, and television and radio personality, as well as the curator, along with his wife Jaimie Leonarder, aka Miss Death, of Australia's most eclectic collection and presentation of weird coolness, the Mu Meson Archives. And together, they have recently launched what is already my favourite Australian podcast and immersive online experience, Naked World. I could go on and on about this man's many contributions to weird and underground culture, but instead let's move straight into a chat with one of the heroes of Australian alternative media, Jaimie Leonarder, aka J. Katz. Unfortunately, my co-host Jen Durrell can't be with us tonight because she's feeling particularly crummy. It seems like it's the side effect of a vaccine that she had to take, actually the hepatitis B vaccine, and she needed to take it as a requirement for her healthcare career.
Horrible.
I know, it's awful. And I also know what she'd ask you if she was here, though. She's an experiencer of all kinds of paranormal phenomena herself, and she's always interested to hear if any of our guests have similar experiences. So I guess that's my first question, as a surrogate for Jen, is, Jaimie, have you ever had any type of paranormal or anomalous experience or experiences?
I think I have had several, but the most distinct one I've had, and I'm not going to go into too much detail because I'm actually, Dean, still trying to find witnesses, was when I was at school. I can't distinctly remember whether I was 8 or 9. It was primary school in Artarmon here on the North Shore in Sydney, Australia, and I had come out for lunch, as had hundreds of other kids, and I noticed they were all running to the paling fences, which were adjacent to a huge football field. Hanging in the air over that football field, a couple of 100 metres in the sky, was a circular object, and it stayed there for the entire lunchtime break. No one, unlike Westall, this object did not land. No one ran over the fence to get underneath the object, but it hung there. And there were some incredible details to this sighting that, in retrospect, less than 24 hours later at school, we were told that it was a weather balloon that made me, at that very young age, realise they are not telling me the truth. That was distinctly not a weather balloon. I'm not going to go into the finer details because I am waiting to see if there are other witnesses. And, you know, I'm 62. This happened over 50 years ago. I doubt I will ever find those witnesses. I did speak to someone in my 20s that had a vague recollection of it. But I believe in the US, and I can't remember the author's name, a book has just been written on schoolyard UFO incidents, documenting well over 100 cases, and I think nearly over 100 years of information there. And this is something that's not rare. I mean, you'd be aware of the incredible case in the late 80s in South Africa in the Ariel School that's about to appear in James Fox and Tracy Torme's latest documentary, Phenomenon. And that is an astounding case where 60 children, even today, are willing to go on the record, just like Westall we had here in Melbourne in the 60s, which is literally hundreds of eyewitnesses. So, yes, I have had numerous instances. That is the most pronounced, and that forced my hand to start writing and reading extensively the literature. I realized that there is distinctly a true and real anomalous phenomena here, especially when you've got credentialed eyewitnesses. Early in the piece, the books I was reading were things like Donald Kehoe's UFO conspiracy. Now, there's someone directly out of the US Air Force that was stating as early as 1950 that there are massive reports from the greatest trained eyewitnesses in the world to distinctly state again that we're dealing with a real phenomenon.
Yeah, well, we had, funnily enough, Richard Doty on as a guest a couple of weeks ago, and he's pretty notorious for his role in the Benowitz affair, but he was also, of course, actual Air Force intelligence, and he has all kinds of stories to report about watching on closed camera interviews with extraterrestrials and seeing enormous discs rolled out of hangars and being conscious of, when he was working in Area 51, of robotic type entities that were manufactured by the US to look like aliens, and all of this almost rabbit hole journey to X-Files type UFO belief. So
how do we, Dean, how do we trust someone like Richard Doherty that was involved in one of the most scandalous incidents, and where they actually they assisted in the psychological demise of Mr. Benowitz? Sorry, that's my very ill cat Anton, and every time I sit down to do a podcast, whether it's visual or audio like yours, Anton will appear. He's actually 15 years of age. He's a Seal Point Siamese, and he's had a couple of strokes, so I need to have him on the lap. I hope you don't mind his constant bantering in the background. I can remove him if need be.
I thought maybe it was a little ET over your shoulder there, but
No, but I would never be able to literally trust what Benowitz was saying. I'm sorry, excuse me, what Richard Doherty was saying. That documentary, Mirage Men, is a fabulous piece of documentary work, and it really leaves you at the end of it thinking this man is just a professional disinformation officer.
Oh, it's a fascinating documentary, Mirage Men, and so's Greg Bishop's book, Project Beta.
Yes.
One of the most interesting things, of course, about talking to Richard Doty is, regardless of what truth he tells or what truth he doesn't tell, or whether you personally like him or not. I get on fine with Richard. He seems like a nice guy, but I understand why people don't trust him. But what's fascinating about talking to Richard is, from my background as a UFO historian, I'm very conscious of his involvement in either the creation or the dissemination or the promulgation, or however you want to term it, of a lot of the dark side type extraterrestrial hypothesis. So much of UFO belief, which is written about and popularized in shows like The X-Files, comes from that small group of researchers and perhaps disinformation artists, William Moore and Stanton Friedman and Richard Doty and Jaimie Leonarder, all of these people, Linda Moulton Howe, these aren't all necessarily allies, but there's a very small group of ufologists that so much of these ideas were disseminated out in the late 70s and 80s and changed the course of the direction of UFO belief up until the current day.
Or did they actually change the course of entertainment? And are those people getting residuals? Because I tell you what, in the creative bankruptcy of Hollywood, those ideas have now permeated the small and the big screen to an incredible extent. And, this is what I've always said to people. It's really difficult in the short amount of time we have on this planet to allocate what you're going to study. And if I'm going to spend my time embedded in fiction, I tell you what, non-fiction is far more rewarding for its tentacles that reach deeply into the human imagination.
Oh, absolutely. And speaking about content which deals with the UFO phenomenon, your audio documentary, To Catch a Flying Star, which people can listen to now on the Mu Meson Archive channel on YouTube, is just fantastic. And I didn't know prior to talking to you now that you'd had the type of experiences that must have led you in the direction of making that documentary. But for listeners who mightn't be aware of Australian UFO encounters, are there some reports which you cover in that documentary that you think are particularly worth talking about? I mean, I think there's a few, but I'll let you pick them.
Well, the onus for that, and I actually went on location with a sound recordist and another researcher to the Nullarbor to investigate the Knowles family case in the late 80s in Australia, where a family of four, a mother and three sons, were literally lifted off the air highway just on the border of Western Australia and South Australia at Mundrabilla. That was my onus initially. I was a little bit late. It was a bit belated. It was quite a few years after the incident, the early 90s, that I actually went there. And I was fascinated in that whole area because it was stooped in being a geological position of very high strangeness. But what that audio documentary is, and I am very proud of that audio documentary, because it's a potted history and it hadn't ever been done before. And it was on a very pronounced program on the ABC, the Australian Broadcasting Commission's Radio Eye. It was the first time that a program from Radio Eye had drawn so much attention from the public that it ended up being released into the stores, Dean, on cassette. And it had such an interest at the time that we came back a month later and did a program of just phone calls to rural Australia. Now, just like rural America or rural Europe, people that live off the land are extremely pragmatic in the incidents that they encounter every day in trying to keep a cattle station or a crop growing. And if something occurs that's outside of their notion of consensus reality, they have to deal with it. They will recognize it. They tend to know virtually every blade of grass or every grain of sand on their land. And when something odd occurs, they distinctly know it's different, but they also have to get back to tending to their properties, which, 9 times out of 10 are a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week job. So I just love the pragmatism, the realism, the authentic nature of those stories when they're in rural areas. There seems to be even a stronger sense of the veracity of the truth that we're dealing with, because people have so much more that they have to deal with than just the everyday life and the distractions and what can happen in the city.
Speaking of the veracity of rural witnesses, at a festival I now run here in Eau Claire, Wisconsin called Midwest Weird Fest, we screened the world premiere of a documentary called Return to Wildcat Mountain, Wisconsin's Black Panther Nexus, from the esteemed Fortean cryptid author Linda Godfrey.
Wow.
It's primarily set in southwest Wisconsin in an area called the Driftless area, which also drops down into Illinois and over into Minnesota and down into Iowa, I believe. It's this hilly area with all these valleys and mountains and the like, where when the glaciers moved through in the Ice Age, they kind of apparently missed this area. Anyway, it's this location where all of these kind of strange, anomalous phenomenon take place, including reports of large black panthers, which of course aren't native to North America any more than they're native to Australia, where these reports are also recorded. And back to the veracity of rural witnesses, this documentary is packed with rural witness after rural witness after rural witness describing in very down-to-earth terms what they saw, a large black panther that, according to the scientific consensus, should not exist in North America. And listening to these reports, you have no doubt that that's what these people saw. They've been around animals their entire life, either raising them or hunting them. They're not mistaking it for a deer, or, they're not seeing a bear and thinking it's a black panther, or even a bobcat and thinking it's a black panther. Now, I'm always uncertain as to the physical reality of what a lot of witnesses actually report, but I don't doubt what a lot of witnesses are seeing. And in this case, after you've watched this documentary, you have no doubt that what these people have seen is a large black panther that science tells them should not exist in southwestern Wisconsin, let alone anywhere in the United States of America.
And it's fascinating you say what you do about the contradiction in the nature of these sightings. I've spent some time here in New South Wales looking into Kangaroo Valley. And there, at one point in Kangaroo Valley here, there was so many sightings of what looked to be a black panther. And I mean, from an anthropological point of view, you have to understand that there needs to be a breeding colony. And these went over decades, and it was to such an extent that they did a full police scour of literally tens of kilometres hand to hand to see if they had come across a breeding colony. Now, I spoke to a beautiful woman who I imagine is not on this mortal coil anymore. This was decades ago, called Doris Blindman. And she had had sighting after sighting after sighting. And what started to dawn on me is what started to dawn on a lot of ufological, Fortean, or anomalous researchers, that there's so much more to these incidents than just the sighting of a black cat. She had no distinct memory of any clear facial features. She would smell things like sulfur, which can be apparent in spectral encounters. She never had any footprints or markings left, although she did have, in a contradictory way, scratch marks on her door from one of these instances. And she was also, when asked more broadly questions about her anomalous experience, experiencing a whole range of anomalous experiences, from time dilation to synchronicity to UFO sightings to spectral visions. So sometimes it's really up to the ability of the researcher to actually broaden their perspective. And I think we were lucky that in the early 60s, when I started to investigate this after my own incident, one of the first authors I went to was John Keel, which people would know on a mainstream level was the author of the Mothman Prophecies, which actually became a film with Richard Gere. And he had a much broader phenomenalist perspective. He had actually taken into account a lot of the indigenous templates from Eastern Europe and from Asia, and was able to look at this thing in a wider perspective, and then began to realize that there's no such thing as someone just having an incident of one singular phenomenon.
Refresh my memory, Jaimie. Is that area Kangaroo Valley in New South Wales Blue Mountains?
No, it's the opposite to the Blue Mountains. It's actually going down the coast, a couple of hours out of Sydney, or more than a couple of hours out of Sydney. But, I mean, the Blue Mountains, we've had David Pilates out here. If you go up on Can-Am Project on YouTube, he's actually putting out some amazing stuff. But you'll see 3 stories to do with those anomalous disappearances he puts under the umbrella of Missing 411 up in the Katoomba area, but that is distinctly one of the major spots of high strangeness in Australia, from UFO sightings to extensive yowies, which is the Australian term for Bigfoot or Sasquatch or Yeti, and it has a history. It's even written into the indigenous names of the area. I believe there's a valley up there. I can't give you the indigenous term, but when it's translated into the common speak of English, it becomes the Valley of the Hairy Man. Now, you know, Pilates found references to these strange, anomalous disappearances and were all around different areas that had names. Those names would actually heighten the notion of exercising caution before going into those geographical spots.
I think you're so right. If you look at a map, for example, not that far to the south of me, there's a place called Devil's Lake. And sure enough, in traditional Native American mythology, that lake used to supposedly have a sea serpent, or, well, not a sea serpent, it's in a lake, but a lake monster in it. And similarly, if you look at a Devil's Peak somewhere, there's likely to be a hairy man report attached to it, or the like. Sometimes I think these locations, and coming back to John Keel, who you mentioned, there are these window areas, and that's similar to the driftless area that I mentioned before where those black panthers are seen in Wisconsin. That's also an area which has a lot of UFO sightings, and it has Bigfoot sightings. And it does seem, whether it's because there is some type of geographic anomaly, like a high level of quartz in the ground, as some people suggest, or something else causing an electromagnetic effect, or whether the area is a portal, or whatever your perspective is, there certainly seem to be those places, whether it's in the Blue Mountains in New South Wales, or whether it's in the Kangaroo Valley you were talking about, or whether it's the driftless area here, or whether it's somewhere like Skinwalker Ranch, which is very popular at the moment, again, because of a recent television show in America. There do seem to be these areas where you get all kinds of strange phenomenon.
Well, I think the truth lies in Indigenous cultures and their history. You'd be aware that one of the world's leading primatologists, Dr. Jane Goodall, has gone on the record to state that she is absolutely certain that something like Bigfoot exists. And primarily the reasoning behind that statement is because she said you cannot dispense with the knowledge of Indigenous cultures. And just about every single Indigenous culture written into their oral or written history has a place for these incidents, where modern 20th century white Western culture has no longer got that template. So when you're talking about the world's leading primatologists going, hey, respect Indigenous knowledge, these names are not just mythology or folklore. In a sense, that's quite disparaging. Look back at what they were telling us. They're actually warning us that these areas literally are a collapse of consensus reality.
And back quickly, because it's something else I wanted to talk to you about. In To Catch a Flying Star, there's some interviews with witnesses of the Min Min lights as well. I was always fascinated with them as a child because we had a family member, Auntie Helen was her name for me, and she lived in Queensland on a property, and she would tell stories about seeing these lights come in and dance around and then disappear again. And here in Wisconsin and other parts of rural America, there's often traditions of spook lights, which are very similar to the Min Min lights, but I'm guessing that a lot of our listeners haven't heard about the Min Min lights. So if you want to fill people in on that, that'd be fantastic as well.
Well, maybe your listeners would be more familiar with the Marfa lights in Marfa, Texas, which again are highly distinctly similar to our notion of the Min Min lights. Now, it's no wonder that your Auntie Helen was up there in Queensland, because these stories, when it comes down to white written culture, especially in the 20th century, first all came out of far northwest Queensland around the town of Boulia, which has its own animatronics Min Min display. But they literally go from one end of the continent to the other. And I think if you go back into Indigenous culture, and please do not quote me on this, I'm subtextualizing and I don't want to offend anyone, but I believe that Mini and the Nini are a derivative of Indigenous words for the female and the male spirits of the dead. And as it is, the Aboriginals in this country used to warn their children that if you walk too far for the tribe at night, you will experience a Min Min light which will drag you into the dream time forever. Now that might be a 20th century white Australian myth, but it also seems to stem from some knowledge dating way back thousands of years with our Indigenous culture. There's a paradox to the Min Min lights, and that is, and I've spent time out there on the Nullarbor and Broken Hill and many remote areas across Australia, where I will speak to ruse shooters, because ruse shooters are probably the best eyewitnesses. They're out there from sunset to dawn, and they spend most of their time and life around very rural areas trying to pick up that game, and 9 times out of 10, they will experience the Min Min light. They may experience one night where it's in the equidistance to them, and they will stab it and steer it, and that thing will remain at that equidistance no matter how hard they drive. And here's the contradiction. The next night, they're out there walking up a boundary fence after a roo, and the goddamn thing dive bombs them. So They can start off as a fluorescent ball, as small as a golf ball, usually around the size of a softball. But I've spoken to truck drivers, and there is a couple of truck driver incidents there on the air highway down at Eucla, and they're really worth listening to on the audio program To Catch a Flying Star, where they actually had them come up behind the trucks and turn into a solid ufological disc of many meters in length. So the Min Min light is a contradictory phenomenon. What I found in Broken Hill, which is a huge mining town and is featured extensively in many films shot in Australia, especially the great one Wake in Fright, the original Wake in Fright. And it's a huge mining town, cobalt, uranium, all sorts of things are mined there. When I spoke to the miners there, Dean, they said they used to witness the Min Min light following the line of load. And that is the line of the shaft that they are digging, the coal or whatsoever, and it would follow it down into the mine shaft. And they were having Min Min light encounters in the mine shaft. There were drovers at the turn of the 20th century that had encountered the Min Min light whilst they were droving and spent the rest of their life trying to capture one. And of course, a futile quest that turned out to be. Don Mears, a maverick independent filmmaker I've worked with, and your American audience might be aware of his first documentary around this subject matter called Australian Skies, was up on Netflix there for a while. He's done an Australian Skies 2, has just finished a beautiful documentary entitled simply The Min Min Light, and which I appear extensively potted up against a couple of academics there that I don't feel, this might sound a bit arrogant, but I'm just trying to stand back from this at 62 years of age. I don't think they fared as well as I did in that documentary. Make up your own mind. But I'm sure you can find that on just about all streaming sources at the moment. And Don from Dogo Media really does need your support because he finances these films from the ground up by himself. And that's because, as you'd be aware from your tenure in Australia, that it's very difficult to get broadcasters to think about the huge audience base that are interested in this phenomena until you've made something and put it up there and proved it to them.
There's so many things I want to talk to you about after that, and I want to get back to film and audience and those type of things with you in a minute. But just to rewind a little into what you were saying about the legend of Aboriginal, perhaps parents or elders warning children that if they went out at night, they might get taken by the Min Min lights, and then tying that in to David Paulides' Missing 411, who you mentioned before as well. I just want to hear your take on it, Jay, because I always respect your incredibly vast knowledge on all things paranormal, and we'll talk about your collection in the Mesons as well in a minute, hopefully, of all the type of literature and films and the like that you have. But there always seems to be this push in the audience of Missing 411 to want to work out the exact thing which is taking people. Like, is it the aliens? Is it the Bigfoot? Is it the serial killer? Is it underground monsters? But if we look at the whole phenomenon closer to, again, somebody you mentioned, John Keel, that perhaps something like a Bigfoot or a UFO or a Virgin Marian apparition or any of these things might actually be a manifestation of the same phenomenon. I think that makes more sense looking at Missing 411 because occasionally you'll hear a report in David Paulides' work of people seeing something that looked like a hairy man or a Bigfoot running with something on its shoulder after a child had disappeared. Or sometimes you'll hear somebody describing something which sounded like a steel trap closing when somebody disappeared. So there seem to be all these different potential explanations. And recently, I think it was Bruce Maccabee, the UFO researcher cum physicist's wife in one of David Paulides' books, mentioned that she was out bow hunting and she saw something that looked like a predator type effect, that kind of semi-invisible cloak.
You've just given the spoiler away there, Dean, but I think you've actually hit the nail on the head. And this is one of the astounding things to me about this incredible researcher that has come onto the scene as one of the brightest, freshest lights in anomalous research. And of course, Dean, you'd be aware that my wife is Greek, and so is David Paulides of Greek origin. And I think the Greeks have a really good take on this. I mean, we're talking about the fathers of philosophy, democracy and mathematics here. Certainly there've got to be some spiritual alignment in their consciousness after thousands of years, and there certainly is in David Paulides. Again, here's a person who worked extensively in the national parks for the police service for well over a couple of decades, became writing about especially indigenous myths around the Bigfoot there, and then realized through consultation with other national park rangers that there were a large number of disappearances that weren't being collated and weren't being accessed to the public, that remained anomalous, that were outside of the range of predators or abductions. They contradictions in them where you take in sniffer dogs, cadaver dogs that could not find the scent, that you'd find clothing in one neat pile as if someone was there 1 minute and melted out of it the next, that you would find children tens of kilometres away from sites within a short amount of time. There is no way that they could have strolled to those areas, that people are found, if they are found dead, they're found floating in a river, the wrong way round for a cadaver to do that, especially when lividity has set into the human body, which is the draining of blood to that single gravitational point in the corpse. But, the one thing about Paulides that's so exciting is he does not give any hypothesis whatsoever. Because a hypothesis is an assumption. It's an extrapolation that the jury's not in on just yet. It's really important that we look at these cases in their singularity. They can be easily dismissed in their singularity, but in their totality, and that's the astounding work that David has done, compile them in book after book after book with hundreds of consistent cases. In their totality, you realize that we are dealing with a very real phenomena that is highly contradictory, paradoxical, and at the same time shows that there is a huge fault in the Western thinking about this three-dimensional tactile reality we live in. Maybe the reality we live in is far more malleable, and we need to go to string theory and look at quantum physics for an explanation before we start putting it down to the category of another anomalous phenomena in which the jury is not in on yet as well. But I think that's one of the most important points of all, that let's look at the data. And if science has a problem, science should balance the evidence out. And as you were saying right at the beginning of the program, that when you start listening to people in rural areas and their ability to pragmatically expose their knowledge of the terrain they're living in, and when something anomalous appears in it, the irregularity of that anomaly, then what I think we're doing there is holding eyewitness testimony up on the scales of justice alongside of scientific reductionism. One of the problems in 20th century thinking is reductionistic thought, that human beings always search for an answer, an explanation, and quite simply, if you were to diagnose and break down all levels of science, from medicine right through to technology, there is still so much we do not know.
I couldn't, again, agree with you more. And it ties back to both what you were saying about Paulides not making a hypothesis and John Keel. Keel said, belief is the enemy. And I think that remains true whenever we look at anomalous phenomenon. And going into what you were just saying about science, the second that some type of paradigm is put forward, we run into all kinds of problems. And I think the attempts of a lot of, particularly UFO researchers, but also people who research Bigfoot and the like, their attempts to be accepted by science or to replicate science seem to fail again and again, the same way that science itself, and when I say science, I mean the scientific establishment, has failed the UFO phenomenon, for example. Condon would be a classic example, but this should be expected when we read the great philosophers of science, like Thomas Kuhn, who talked about science being like any other sociological organization based upon people jumping on board an idea because people who were perhaps the popular kids in the class, for lack of a better term, already liked that idea, that somehow scientific theory was as conversionary as religious belief. And it operated in revolutions. In other words, one paradigm would come along and everybody would jump on board, and then there would be so many cracks that would collapse, and some other popular kid would suggest another paradigm and people would jump on board that. And I think we see that problem rolling over into Fortean research as well, whenever people tend to feel the need to replicate science in their own research.
You know, now after 50 years of puzzling over this varied and vast range of anomalies we seem to have in our etheric space on planet Earth, I couldn't agree with you more. I love your way of thinking. I love that open-mindedness. I believe we need to question everything, but we should also question the notion of skepticism. Most skeptics I come across are like atheists. They become very dogmatic and they seem to become the paradox of what they're fighting against. In a way, they're as dogmatic as the theology that they're trying to tear down. What we need to do is balance evenly based on the evidence, eyewitness testimony, and you know what, human beings, we seem to have lost this notion that human beings have something intuitively within their DNA. It's called common sense. And common sense will tell you from a deep physical and mental level that you're actually experiencing something way out of your range of understanding. I mean, when you listen to Sasquatch Chronicles and you hear time and time again that seasoned veterans of hunting from generations of hunting, when they actually do roll upon an incident that appears to involve something like a parallel hominid, their worldview collapses before anything else. And all of them seem to relate those stories with an extreme amount, and you can hear it in the way that they actually speak, post-traumatic stress disorder. Now that doesn't come from a delusion, that doesn't come from a nightmare, that has to come from being torn out of the comfortable, conscious space you're in and placed into something that's so unusual that has caused trauma. I mean, most veterans of war suffer post-traumatic stress disorder because once their moment that they are on the battlefield in the midst of it all, it's beyond anything they watched on film or television. It is absolutely so frightening to their worldview and their mortality that they are traumatized for the rest of their life. And you know, I see that time and time again in people that have had ufological, spectral, or paranormal or anomalous experience. As a matter of fact, I was dealing with a gentleman on the phone today that was so traumatized that I was distinctly in fear and trying desperately to approach some medical authority that would be at least open-minded enough to listen to the story that this person was articulating to me. And it's virtually impossible, and it's quite a frightening situation to be. If I can just end this by extrapolating a little further, after this 50 years of research at this point in my life, I have pulled back from utilizing terms like alien or anything that puts the phenomena we're dealing into a structural box like a digital square. I think that I'm at a point now that has taken me back into the public field of ufology as the Vice President of Australia's UFO Research New South Wales, where the main thing I want to deal with is the removal of the noise around the signal, of which 90% of this phenomena is covered in the noise of popular culture, exploitation, possibly disinformation, and I want to remove the ridicule. I want people to be able to talk to their spouse, their family, their neighbors about their anomalous experience. The one thing that will remove post-traumatic stress disorder is the ability to be cathartic. And my biggest fear is we're dealing with a world that will not accept these stories. And my fear is that, we'll be looking at a lot more mental aberration and illness because of it. And my background, as you're well aware, is in nursing. And I've spent many times dealing with people that you could put up on the spectrum. Sometimes I consider those people to be way more shamanic than the 21st century world will let them be.
And speaking of your background, people should check out the documentary about your life. What's the name of Brendan's doco again?
Yes, Brendan Young was the director. The documentary is called Love and Anarchy, and at the moment we have it up on Patreon, part of our Naked World visual podcast for a pandemic, and it's part of the Mu Meson Archives. We do have a YouTube channel, so if people want to check us out, they could go to that YouTube channel. Look, that is so vast and varied. You know, at times during life, I don't know if you've done this, but I've done this as a performance artist, someone interested in fringe cinema, all sorts of counterculture. I've compartmentalized my life. But at 62 years of age, with time running out, Dean, and in the midst of this global situation we're in, I've managed to swing around with one of the most profound younger producers, and I'm letting all those worlds collide. So the totality of that site might be a bit difficult for people because you're looking at a band I had of musicians that were all mentally ill. That was quite an abstract band. It sort of varied into noise and the avant-garde. You're looking at some really wacky cinema that we've put together as well. You're looking at some beautiful DJing the wife and I did live. But you're also looking at our foot deeply embedded in the world of Fortean studies. All those worlds collide. You can check them out on the Mu Meson Archive's YouTube channel. But what would really help us is if people went on to Patreon, and it's just basically MUMESONS.com. Will take you to our website and then lead you to Patreon. And just for $5 a week, they can support grassroots artists that have no income in this incredible global incident in this time. And I know we're not the only ones, but we're desperately peddling here at the archives to keep ourselves afloat. And I'm just digitizing my entire life now, and which feels really good. And thank you for letting me have that extended plug.
You almost answered all of my following questions. The audience mightn't be aware of. You're actually a very good friend of mine, and you're certainly one of the people who helped me most in my career in Sydney way back in, I think, 2007. It was a year that Lisa Mitchell and myself launched a Night of Horror Film Festival, which was the first festival I ever ran in Sydney. You and Miss Death, or Asper, were both so kind to be members of the festival's jury. And you also had us on for an extensive interview on your, at the time, this cult Sydney radio program on FBI, which was one of the hippest, most popular channels, and yours was the hippest, most popular show on that radio station, and it was called The Naked City. And now you've gone global, just for context for the audience, with your Naked World podcast.
You're an incredible inspiration to us. And you were such an open and giving, and still are, person that was very interested in all the peripheral information. And what you did for independent genre cinema is really profound. And I don't think you've ever stopped doing that. I don't think there's much difference between either of us, but my friendship with you will always remain one of the true assets in my life. You know, that connection of souls with very similar interests. I was absolutely bowled over. And I think there's been a grave injustice out there in terms of your dissertation. The fact that you wrote quite possibly what should be recorded and isn't recorded as the first doctoral thesis on this subject matter from a university in Australia. Am I correct there, or am I sort of jumping the gun a bit?
Oh, thanks, Jaimie. That's really kind of you to say. Yes, the dissertation is called Flying Saucer Culture, an Historical Survey of American UFO Belief. And funnily enough, I'm looking to publish it sometime in the not-too-distant future. But because I initially wrote it, or rather initially completed it, back in 2006, before I push it out there, I want to go back and write a new foreword and maybe add some updates. So it's something I've been interested in for a very long time. And the funniest thing of all is, while I talk about first meeting you when you supported Lisa Mitchell and I launching A Night of Horror in Sydney, the first time I was aware of you, as I can't remember if it was in what newspaper it was in. It was in a major paper. It was like the Telegraph or the Herald or the Australian. There was a piece while I was doing my dissertation and when I was living and breathing UFO belief in one of those papers about the Mu Meson Archives. And the photo was, I believe, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, it was a photo of you in a grey extraterrestrial mask, and it was talking about this incredibly sounding organizational place called the Mu Meson Archives. And so I'm glad I finally found you guys, probably a couple of years later, but I still found you.
You know, that photo is available to anyone who wants to punch it into Google Earth, and we've got the article up on the Patreon site and on our Mu Meson Archives website, which is a separate thing to our YouTube channel. You know what? That was one of those absurd moments where you just realize in hindsight, maybe I shouldn't have slipped that mask on. They must have taken at least 20, 30 photographs of myself and my wife in our store we had at that stage, and that was just prior to the internet really taking off. So what we were doing, we were importing fanzines, DIY fanzines from all around the world, which were probably one of the greatest sources of fringe material that wouldn't get printed in orthodox press. And especially on the subject matter we're dealing with now, I mean, people are aware of the extraordinary Fortean Times that has existed for many decades out of Britain, but there were so many ufological journals that weren't getting any mainstream action, and we were importing them from companies like the late great Arcturus Books there in the States. A fascinating catalogue of literature there, which was really exciting for us. But of course, it was a rather silly moment at the end of that photo shoot where I said, oh, why don't you try a photo like this? And of course, the absurd court jester image ended up being the ubiquitous one in one of our leading papers, the Sydney Morning Herald. And do you think that gave me any kudos with my family? None whatsoever.
And speaking about the Mu Meson Archives, particularly for the audiences who aren't in Sydney or Australia, you guys, you and Miss Death, were responsible for curating probably the most eclectic, entertaining, weird underground cinema program maybe the world's ever seen, year after year after year at the Mu Meson Archives.
Well,
so
I don't know. That's so kind of you to say the world's ever seen. And I know that Craig Baldwin over there in San Francisco at Access Media outweirds us sometimes like you wouldn't imagine. You know, Dean, there's a paradox here. Are we just, insecure hoarders buried alive in the ephemera of the fringes of the 20th and the 21st century? Or are we true archaeologists uncovering valuable things that speak about the truth of this world a little bit more? I think I've got one foot in one camp and one in the other. I distinctly am not a person embedded in collecting culture. I'm not a completist. My whole thing is that I just want people to see that there's another side of viewing reality that steps away from orthodoxy, and sometimes that other side is much more rewarding, even though it doesn't come with the bells and the whistles of high-end production.
Well, it's funny. I, being somebody who, as you kindly mentioned before, wrote my PhD thesis on, or dissertation, as they would say in the US where I am now, on UFO belief, I thought I probably had the largest private collection of UFO books in maybe not the Southern Hemisphere, but probably in Sydney. Like, I had a lot of books. But then I remember after I finished the dissertation, I came and visited you guys at the Mesons one time. Your library there just absolutely blew me away. But as well as books, you have such an incredible collection of cinema as well. And the Mesons just screened, as I was mentioning before, an amazing assortment of fringe cinema. But what are some of your favorite films that deal with UFOs or Bigfoot or any kind of cryptids or the paranormal, particularly documentaries?
The one thing people might realize is that, and Dean, that is so kind of you again. My God, if we ever make any money out of this podcast, I'm sending you a check instantly. But we collect 16mm, 35, Standard 8, Super 8, 9.5, but we do screen a lot of 16mm film. I still believe that film will be the only way to safely guard the history of cinema. I think digitally we're actually going into a collision of formats that may prove extremely problematic in terms of archiving even just a few decades down the track. And I still have nitrate film, which they consider extremely dangerous. It's not that dangerous. I've tested it out. But that it has survived well over 100 years and still holds the image quite well. I never believed I owned a film till I actually found a 16mm print. And there's something to be said about that collectors on the fringes, sometimes dealing legally or even into the darkness of films where they don't hold the rights, they just hold the print, have become the major archaeologists of lost material. We've given back to the ABC in this country, the Australian Broadcasting Commission, more lost TV shows than anyone, and we've given them back to them free of charge. They just needed to learn that they need to keep those things as historical items, and they can use them throughout modern day footage reflecting back on the history of culture and its social engineering. Some of the films that I have here dealing with that subject matter, I have an extremely lost documentary from one of our free-to-air stations in the 70s by the one and only Roger Clemson. His name will be unknown to people in the US, but he was a big name as a newsreader here in Sydney, New South Wales in Australia for many, many decades. And that film is so much an example of white Australian culture trying to deal with something way outside of their range of thinking. It's not only hilarious, it's actually very insightful and really an astounding time capsule of the way that we dealt with this subject matter, especially running off the back of the interest that was gleamed into the mainstream through people like Eric von Daniken and Chariots of the Gods. I've got a whole run, and I know they've been released on DVD and Blu-ray, of Leonard Nimoy's In Search Of, which I still think was an incredible program. The episodes were only 22 minutes in length, a television half hour. But within the 6 seasons of that series, bookended by Leonard Nimoy, like Rod Serling in many ways, and they're all real investigations. There's one episode there that's quite insightful that's just called UFOs in Australia. They did an entire episode of UFOs at that point, deeming that this country was a real hotbed for sightings. So, the list is way too long, Dean. I'm actually in the midst of this. I'm using this moment of lockdown to do this sort of odd spring clean, and I'm finding things I didn't even realize I've got. And depending on the money behind a film print, and a lot of the stuff we search for is rare and obscure and a lot of independent productions, they may have only struck 3 safety prints from the original negative in its day. You might be aware of William Shatner's only ever the only ever Esperanto film in the world, which was the universal language. You remember Esperanto? We had an Esperanto house down in Redfern here. And that was done by the geniuses behind, gee whiz, and there's a Wisconsin connection here too, Joseph Stefano and Leslie Stevens, behind Outer Limits. The first season, they had a company called Daystar. It was very radical and brilliant that first season, authors like Harlan Ellison, screenplays and things like that.
Wow.
They left after the first season and did this extraordinary film called Incubus, and it's like a gothic feature-length episode of The Outer Limits starring William Shatner, and it was all in Esperanto. Well, that film and that negative were lost forever. The negative's gone, but they found an odd subtitle print in Scandinavia, and the remastering of it has come completely from a collector that came across that one safety reel. So I don't think we're just collectors. I think we're archaeologists of the fringes of popular culture, and I believe it's a very important job, because for every mainstream product that's absolutely denigrated in its sense by trying to search for its more positive commercial value, things on the fringes are the people that break the ground, the innovators, where the truth really lies in our culture and later on gets capitalized and exploited.
Well, Jaimie, you are one of the innovators and you always have been. And you were an inspiration to me throughout my career as a film programmer and also throughout my interest, particularly after I met you, in this type of subject matter. So all I can say is thank you so much for coming on the show, and we need to have you and Aspa, aka Miss Death, to rejoin us, and hopefully Jen will be feeling better then to do another episode sometime in the very near future.
Well, I know she will. She'll get over that. And it's really important that your show exists and that people in America begin to realize the incredible inspirational and creative power behind your mind. But the other thing that you've got, Dean, which is a rarity, I believe, in our white Western culture, and that is a generosity of spirit that is astounding. So I just want to thank you very much for the ability to spend some more time with you, conversing on subject matter that we adore. And I just wish you all the best with Talking Weird, and I hope people go up and have a look at Don Mears' Min Light. I hope they go and have a peek at the Mu Meson's YouTube channel, or if they want to really step into the archives, go and have a look at Naked World on Patreon. The other thing is you can go up onto Facebook and under my stage name, my wife's stage name is Miss Death, not based anything on this pandemic. It's based on an old Jesus Franco film and a nightclub act with a dancer that was in a cobweb. I'll explain that story later on to you down the track, maybe privately. And my name is Jay Katz, Jaykatz, and they can see the whole bevy of interests that we have there. And you know, just like yourself, the one thing that has always fascinated me more than anything else is human nature, human imagination, our ability to investigate, our hunter-seeker mentality. And I just want to wish everyone out there the greatest health and safety, and keep listening to Talking Weird, because I tell you what, there's nothing more satisfying than the truly weird.
Jaimie Leonarder, aka Jay Katz, is truly one of the good guys on this crazy planet. And if you're as bored with mainstream content as I am, consider giving the flick to one of your streaming services and spending the money you save on a Naked World Patreon subscription instead. It's a heck of a lot more enlightening and loads of fun to boot. You can find that Patreon link via the official Mu Meson site at mumesons.com. That's MUMESONS.com. To get a taste of what you can expect on that Patreon page, visit the Mu Meson Archive on YouTube. There you'll find a free version of the To Catch a Flying Star audio documentary that we discussed at some length during this episode. And like the Mu Meson Archives on Facebook at Mu Meson Archives Sydney. Of course, you can always find us at talkingweird.com. If you haven't already, please like the show on Facebook and Instagram at Talking Weird Podcast. Make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing to Talking Weird. We're available on most podcast platforms and YouTube. And if you enjoy the show, please leave us a review. Jen and I would really appreciate it. Next week, Jen will be jumping back on the Weird Train to join our chat with Lon Strickler, the founder and webmaster of Phantoms and Monsters, one of the world's most popular go-to cryptid and paranormal sites. Lon's also the author of several books on the topic, including the recently released Winged Cryptids, Humanoids, Monsters, and Anomalous Creatures casebook. That's an interview you really don't want to miss. And until then, stay safe and keep it weird.